On behalf of all of us, I welcome Dr. Abhishek Singhvi in our webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, though he doesn't need any introduction and all of us know him. Dr. Singhvi is a senior, three-term sitting member of Rajya Sabha and well known as India's foremost senior advocate and jurist. He is a former chairman of Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice, and at the age of 34, he was India's youngest designated senior advocate. At the age of 37, in the year 1997, Dr. Singhvi got appointed as Additional Solicitor General. He is also senior most serving national spokesperson of the Congress Party. His columns have been appearing in India's two top English dailies and have been published in 2 books. He is awarded Global Leader for Tomorrow Award by World Economic Forum at Davos in the year 1999. He has been opening the lead speaker for Treasury Congress benches in Parliament from the year 2006 to 2013. He has been common factor in all landmark Supreme Court cases of great importance. He supports many charities including Prayas, Center for Destitute Children, and the Singhvi Scholarship at Trinity College at Cambridge. Former chairman of Indo-US Forum for Parliamentarians, former president of SARC Law and Apex NGO of judges, lawyers and law persons of the state region, governing member of National Law Universities of Jodhpur and Delhi. He is also taught at St. John's College, Cambridge, UK, and did a brief summer program called PIL from Harvard, USA. Dr. Singhvi will be addressing us today on the topic of institutional pillars of Indian democracy. Friends, I request Dr. Singhvi to address all of us. We also acknowledge the presence of Mr. Gopal Mukherjee from Calcutta, Learned Senior Counsel, Dr. Virendra Saraf, Learned Senior Counsel from Mumbai, and my dear friend Mr. Mahesh Agarwal, the senior most AOR in Delhi Supreme Court. Over to you, sir. Dr. Singhvi, please. Before that, I request all of you to mute your video and audio for better quality of the webinar. Please cooperate. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for a very generous introduction and a very safe 46th, 47th Corona day with this new technology. One of the great side beneficial effects of Corona has been the spawning of Corona jokes. Of course, I have at earlier seminars mentioned some of them. My favorite being the one where the pharmacist fainted when a lady asked for masks matching the color of her sari. This Corona has given us lots and lots of puns, starting with the pun about a pandemic and not a pandemic, and the fact that people complain to others saying that we are eating so much that we are fattening the curve instead of flattening it. Well, you've had a series of lectures, all of you. I hope all of you can hear me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
You had a series of lectures. In fact, from the list sent to me short few days ago, I think you have these lecture series which appear to be mostly on law, oozing out of your ears. So I'm going to try a little different. I won't be giving you hardcore technical law. It is legal. What I am speaking about is not illegal, not even illegal. It is about constitutional structures which underpin our democracy. And in that sense, it are the constitutional legal foundations of the very nature of our polity. Before I turn to my stated and advertised topic, just a few preliminary points are important. First of all, some of it is obvious. I think it's very important to state the obvious, to restate and underline the obvious, because to do that is important to protect the precious so that you don't take it for granted. It is also important to remind you that when these pillars are diluted, assaulted, diminished, you become more aware. Of course, an important aspect is that the non-institutional pillars are even more important than the institutional ones, because the institutional pillars of Indian democracy are founded directly on the bedrock of the non-institutional ones. And of course, I will be covering both, although it's titled Institutional Pillars of Indian Democracy, it's really, to be accurate, institutional and non-institutional pillars. Before I come to the topic, I must also remind you of another backdrop. India is planet Earth's most diverse spot. When you talk of such subjects, you must keep that in mind. It is the second most populous nation in planet Earth, 7th largest in area, 6th largest economy maybe formally by nominal GDP, but most believe either 3rd or 4th by purchasing power parity. And as I said, or I want to say that I want to eschew politics as far as possible, although we are discussing the polity, and there is no democracy without politics and there is no polity without politics. But I will eschew politics in the narrower sense in which is understood. So in this preliminary point, we have to note that we have been very fortunate that we are growing roughly from 1998 to 2017. You see the years I have taken to avoid any political overtones. Roughly at 7.10% per year average annual growth rate year on year. Some years have been close to 9+%. And the last preliminary point, the last two preliminary points are about the fact that an aspect of our diversity is reflected in the fact that we have 22 scheduled languages, 700 mother tongues, 2,000 dialects, largest population of 4 religions, many of which originated here, the 2nd or the 3rd largest population of Islam, millions of sounds, smells, music, dress, food, habit. So no pillar, institutional or non-institutional, can ignore this humongous diversity of India. And if you want to make the India of your dreams, you have to not only keep it in mind, but you have to promote and protect it. Well, lest you think that I am beating around the bush, let me turn to the topic with one major preliminary point. It's not really preliminary because it relates to the topic. And that is a question I asked several foreign and Indian audiences. It's a very simple question, but very interesting one. Ask yourself why India is the only country which, out of roughly 30-40 countries, which between 1930s to 1960s attained independence. I'm giving just broad-based figures. They attained independence from Belgian imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism, etc., etc. And roughly number 30 to 40 in that period. Why is it that India alone, and I emphasize the word alone, remains a vibrant democracy? A vigorous and vibrant democracy. Even around us, our immediate neighborhood, the whole of the SAARC or the South Asian region, the wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism litter the constitutional landscape. India remains a shining exception amongst a sea of Africa, Australasia, Middle East, Far East, even our Southeast Asian tigers. Barring parts of developed Europe and some parts of North America, not South, we are this shining exception. And many of these countries have emerged from the yoke of imperialism from those continents. Well, what is the answer? Why? First answer is I have no answer. I don't know if you have, I doubt it. Second answer is sheer good luck. If you were to force me to try a rational answer, my answer, and certainly this is subjective for everyone else, is that we got the sequencing right. That of course also by good luck. We got the Gandhi followed by the Nehru. I always joke that had we got the reverse sequence, we might have had trouble. There is no better agitational politician, maybe in the whole of the 19th, 20th centuries, than Gandhi to get a country the size and the diversity of India to get it independence. And that too amazingly, unbelievably, with hardly any bloodshed. But was Gandhi or would Gandhi have been the ideal governance politician? No, we had the Nehru. Nehru could never have got us independence. But we had him as our first Prime Minister. And this, remember, is not a lecture on Nehru. I am not an apologist for Nehru. He certainly is a man with shortcomings, as all of us are. But the core of Nehruvian philosophy, which has protected India's vibrant democracy, in that remarkable exception of every country emerging from the yoke of imperialism, is that he genuinely believed in a pluralist, secular, multi-party democracy. Genuinely. In a liberal democracy. And he believed in nurturing institutions, promoting them, creating them, of course, first and foremost. People, of course, accuse Gandhi of being partial to Nehru. But everybody knows that Gandhi had a very, very far-sighted, intuitive power of recognizing people who were the right people for the right job. So if he was partial to Nehru, there must have been some reason. And that is why sometimes I feel sorry when I hear pygmies with very little knowledge of at least modern Indian history who lambast and launch daily missiles on Nehru. I am the first to concede a man with a lot of faults, but these two, one, the agitational getter of independence, second, the initial 15-20 years governance Prime Minister, have been, according to me, the reason and the best answer to my question, according to me. Of course, before I go on to the first of my non-institutional pillars, I must tell you that Gandhi, for all his saintliness and piety, had a very impish sense of humor. He used to always ask for, or many times ask for, new dentures before starting his fast unto death. Imagine a person asking for new dentures before starting on a fast unto death. Now friends, my first non-institutional pillar, as I said, institutional and non-institutional, I'll be giving you a full list of 9 or 10. But the first one is a non-institutional one, as are 3 or 4 more. They go together, is secularism. The much maligned, the much abused, and yet it is self-preservatory for India. We have to remind ourselves that it's not a largesse we give anyone. It's not a donation by the nation to anyone. If we are the most diverse spot on planet Earth, there is nothing else which can be self-preservatory for India, purely from a selfish, self-centered Indian point of view, than secularism. I personally have believed, from what little study I have done, that India, the very idea of India is that the more you let go, the more it binds. The more you pull, the more the danger of snapping. It's something like a kite. Those of you who've flown a kite, I have in my childhood. Sometimes you have to give what we used to call dheel. Dheel would make it go faster and higher. If you snapped it too soon or you pulled it too soon, it would snap. Forget the debasement of secularism. I am the first to concede all political parties have debased, devalued, distorted secularism. What to me is the best concept or definition of secularism? I found an interesting one from Professor Rajiv Bhargava of Harvard. He said, why did Lincoln use this definition of democracy? Of the people, by the people, for the people. He said, we can all understand why for the people. We can all understand why by the people. He said, why did Lincoln say of the people? Doesn't sound right in the sentence. And then he answers his own question saying, it is to convey a sense of participation to each Indian that he is a co-owner of democracy. It is like a joint owner along with everybody else. Each of us owns a small piece of the democracy. So that is really the essence of secularism. It is of course celebrating unity in diversity instead of imposing uniformity upon diversity. And in this concept of secularism, fear, mistrust, repeated demands of demonstration of your loyalty or nationalism, these are antithetical to the very idea of India. That's why I call it a pillar of Indian democracy, even if it's a non-institutional pillar. Nobody is here as a licensee or at the sufferance of others. Somebody put it nicely. He said there's a very special species of birds, and I quote, he said, some birds are not meant to be caged, that's all. Their feathers are too bright and their songs too sweet and too wild. So you just let them go. India, according to me, is that bird. Its ethos, its democratic traditions are too wide, too argumentative, too diverse to be redefined or be reconfigured for uniformity purposes. Another sterile debate I find nowadays on secularism is why did we include it for the first time in our constitution as late as 1976? Because we all know that from foundation till 76, the word was not there in our preamble. Indira Gandhi did put it. And there is a huge, according to me, totally unnecessary debate. Why state the obvious? Well, I think you need to restate, underline, and I would say more any time before than in the current contemporary scenario. And I'm not talking mere politics, I'm talking of contemporary scenario. We need to restate the obvious to protect the precious. Secularism, before I leave it, I must emphasize, goes along with fraternity and equality, two other central words of our original preamble. Each of these three words, secularism, equality, and fraternity, take color from each other. They cross-fertilize each other. They convey the essence of trust, of a reassurance, of a sense of security, and they are the antithesis of what I call the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds, friends, are distrust, divisiveness, and disharmony. And therefore, if there are attacks, of course, attacks on secularism are always worse from within than from without. It is worse when it happens from those who are in power. And I'm not talking of a particular political party, anybody in power. It is even more worse when it is by senior or elected representatives of those in power. It becomes even more serious at the third level when it goes unpunished, unchallenged, unchecked. The last point about secularism I want to make is that there is a debate, and a valid debate, as to which definition you should choose. A lot of Western conceptions, including the US, is a strict Chinese wall of separation between state and religion. Remember, their histories in England and US were fights between the ruling parties and the church. So a strict separation of church and state was the concept. I personally believe that the other view, which is the Gandhian view, this was the more Nehruvian view, the first one, a strict separation. The Gandhian view appeals to me more in the Indian context of diversity, spirituality, and so many religions, and that is Sarva Dharma Samabhava. Many people don't agree. They might call me a little revisionist, but I don't think the very strict separation concept which applies in Western democracies can be whole-scale replicated in India. Friends, I turn now to a very fascinating second pillar of Indian democracy, of course a non-institutional pillar again, federalism. Federalism is a vital concept for managing diversities. It is an inalienable concept in shared and participatory democracy. It is the synonym of shared identity, without which governance in a diverse country like India would become monopolistic and unilateral. In fact, I have written an article which got me an essay prize, where I said it's the best safety valve for 3 Ds: dissent, discomfort, and dissatisfaction. When you have dissent, discomfort, and dissatisfaction at the lower levels, at state levels, at district levels, at taluka levels, at tehsil levels, federalism, if you have it in reasonable degree, channels these 3 Ds into manageable outlets, like a pressure cooker. And it lets you off steam at the decentralized level so the center doesn't explode. As somebody rightly put it, it quarantines conflicts within states or within sub-state units like districts or tehsils, etc. It decentralizes. Now, here is a fascinating story which I'm going to take you on, and this will take about 5 extra minutes, under federalism, as to how our constitution framers from 1946 to 49 conceived of India, ultimately in 49 and 50 in our constitution, after huge debates, as basically a unitary state. I would say at that time in conception and design, our constitution was maybe 80-90% unitary. And they said we must be federal, we should be federal, but they said we are scared of fissiparous tendencies. The country will break up. We've had partition. We've had the largest movement of human beings across the borders. We've had killings. So they settled for a largely unitary model. But then you had 500 princely states, you had British India. So they gave some federating factors in the constitution, as designed. The amazing story which I'm going to tell you is, and that is why Kenneth Weir, an Australian jurist, said, we are not federal, we call ourselves a federal republic, we are quasi-federal. Quasi-federal means mostly unitary, little bit federal. The amazing story I'm going to tell you now is a story about how we have now over 70 years or 75 years now about almost unintended federalism, accidental federalism, inadvertent, undesigned federalism. Remember, America has federalism, which is true federalism because it's bottom up. Many states of America were independent countries. They gave up their rights partially to become federating units in a union, the United States of America. So that's bottom up federalism. We have top down. We have a unitary state with some federating influence permeating down. But what I'm going to tell you now are 6 examples where, contrary to our framers' design, we had unintended, inadvertent federalism. The first of those 6 under federalism was linguistic federalism. Those of you not old enough do not remember our language riots of the 60s. Linguistic demands at the decentralized level required us to have linguistic federalism. And after much debate, I think the 3-language formula has stood the test of time, roughly from 1960 to now, with minor exceptions. That I call linguistic federalism. Undesigned, unintended, but in practice this happened. That's why I call it inadvertent. Of course, one aside here, we have spent crores, hundreds and thousands of crores trying to impose Hindi. The actual truth is, the more you imposed Hindi, the more there has been revolt, rebellion. But do you know, in the last 20 years, unnoticed by you and me, Hindi is everywhere. And that is not because of government committees, government expenditure, Hindi Salakar Samiti, imposed on north, south, east, west. It is because of our Hindi channels. When you don't impose, when you have a spontaneous, natural spontaneity to people. My political friends from the south speak in broken Hindi, but they speak naturally on channels. My friends from the east speak whatever Hindi they can speak. And you don't make them conscious. That is the way Hindi has grown to be a very important language now, unlike all the attempts. So that's linguistic federalism. The second is, of course, our fast approach of courts to issues of federalism. Independent courts. Remember, an interesting little notice statistic. Of course, there's a political reason for it, but I'm now talking legal and constitutional. From independence till 2000, there were roughly 100 exercises of Article 356. Remember, 356 is the President's Rule article, and that is the biggest antithesis to federalism, because the center can take over a state, to put it crudely and directly. About 100 examples. Do you know from 2000 till now, 20 years, how many there have been? I would say not even 15. Really speaking, 12. Now, what is the reason? The reason is that all pre-2000, the courts used to take 3 or 4 years to judge the legality and validity of exercises of either change of government through elections, minority governments, majority governments, dissolutions, or President's Rule. I'm putting them all, clubbing them all together. So Bommai, which is a celebrated case in 1993-4, was a case where Hegde challenged the President's Rule imposed. The judgment came after 3 years of the actual event. He won the case, but by then the government had changed many times over. President's Rule was over. That is the story of every case, even Rameshwar, the Bihar case, in the early 2000s. But what happened after 2000? In case after case, and I must say that I have the privilege and the pleasure of being a part in almost every case uninterruptedly. Uttarakhand, Arunachal, more recently Maharashtra, Karnataka twice, the midnight hearing and the subsequent second time Karnataka, Goa, so much, Jharkhand, so many examples. All of them, the court's fast speed and a decision either way, this way or that way, has meant that adventurism in people saying, we will do what is to be done, we will see the judgment when it comes later, that has gone down to zero almost. The result is that the consequence of your action, if it is valid, it is upheld. If it is not valid, the floor test takes place in 2, 3, 4 days. President's Rule can be stayed. And therefore, in this light, I think you have actually diluted 356 so considerably in actual practice. The biggest anti-federating influence has been diluted in practice, though it stands as an emergency power of our constitution. The third is Panchayati Raj. We're still under federalism, mind you, the second institutional pillar. On a 1986 report by a person closely related to me, my father, led in early 90s to the 73rd and the 74th constitutional amendments. That brought in Part 9, 9A, etc. of our constitution and created the whole structure which we have today of Panchayati Raj. You know the three-level structure, the state level, the intermediate level and the bottom level. Is that not the greatest federating influence in actual practice? Undesigned, unthought of by our constitution framers, except in theory. It's a silent revolution. As a third-time MP, 90% of the time when I'm going to look at my 400 projects in health and education, across the table sitting from me is a lady, because 50% of the 25 lakh elected officials of panchayat, sarpanches, gram panchayat heads, etc. are women. Most states have reservation. So this is a revolution of federalism and decentralization. Of course, one small development is left out, because 7th schedule, just like you have, there is a similar 11th schedule which says states can devolve by law 29 of these subjects to the extent they like to panchayats. Most states have been cussed about it and have not devolved sufficiently, but that's a different topic. My fourth federating influence is economic liberalization. Remember, these are all unintended, non-designed, but in actual practice, making India far more federal polity. So economic liberalization, whether you date it to 1985, when you had telecom missions, water missions, or 1991, when the biggest was delicensing. We've had first and second generation reforms. We still don't have third generation labor ones. Well, the result is, in simple terms, first, a chief minister today is 3 to 5 times more powerful than a central minister. Delicensing means that central ministers, cabinet ministers have no power compared to what they had pre-91. A top industrialist you ask in your state can spend 75% of his corporate life without traveling to Delhi. They used to require for road shows permission earlier, chief ministers. Now you can get direct FDI. So this has liberalized, federated. Then the fifth is fiscal federalism. Without money, there is no federalism. At the highest for several decades, 30% of all our funds were devolved to the states. So they were poor relatively. The figure now stands over the last 2 decades at 43%. I'm including loans and grants all put together. Devolution, most of which is done through the Finance Commission. 43%, and it is likely to reach 45%, and who knows, after 10 years, 50%. If 45% of all funds are devolved to the state, this is huge fiscal federalism. And GST has added to that, because a large part of GST is to go back. And the last, not the least, is regional parties. You and I don't like the cacophony of regional parties. We consider them corrupt, we consider them ill-organized, not in the national interest. But from 1991, regional parties are institutionalized in Indian politics. The larger part of the map of India is regional, and you cannot ignore them. And contrary to popular misconception, states with coalitions and regional parties have actually achieved very high growth rates in many cases, be it Tamil Nadu, be it Odisha, be it for a while Bihar. So contrary to belief, the so-called cacophony of diversity has not affected, but the reality is it has promoted federalism in a big way, much more than our constitutional framers thought. It has given dignity and voice and manifestation to diversity, because our federalism in 1947 was more theoretical. Friends, I now come to the third very important non-institutional pillar, and I'm told I have till about 1:15 because we started at 12:08, so we have time. Socialism is the third pillar. It's non-institutional still, but a third very important pillar. It's an inherent part of the identity of what we used to call a developing economy, and now I prefer to call a transforming economy, which is India. Just like diversity needs two things, secularism and federalism, the two pillars I've discussed. Same way, disparity needs my third pillar, socialism. In a sense, whether you are to be socialist or not is a non-issue, it's a non-debate. Because socialism doesn't mean Stalinism, it doesn't mean Russian planning of the 60s and 70s. But the ethic, the philosophy has to be socialist by the simple fact that India is such a disparate country with such inequalities. You have to see not only growth equity. I will have growth, growth, growth. Yes, you must, you shall, you should. But you have to have distributive equity as much. So when you must try to increase the size of the cake, you must see how much you can divide, how well you can divide that cake. And that is why the fact that we are essentially a poor country will never allow us to jettison socialism. You know, our poverty line is fairly artificial. On an earlier figure, a little dated, it was 450 rupees per month for rural areas and 578 for urban areas. We have strikingly declined on that line, which is artificial, mind you, from 37% of our population below poverty line to now only 21%. From 2004 to 12, we pulled out 14 crores above the poverty line, although the poverty line is, I think, a very poor definition. Our Gini coefficient, which measures only inequality, still puts us 66 in a list of 136 countries, which means we are fairly unequal. Yes, so therefore in this context, socialism is an inevitability. It's not a choice. Yes, I believe we overstayed our 60s socialism by 10 years, which by the way is the exact difference in our economic growth between us and China. But I again laugh and smile and am amused at ill-informed criticism. Oh, why did we have this approach in the 60s or the 70s? I have been, many of you may not, to Pakistan 6 times in the 1980s and 90s. I find that from toast to refrigerators to cars, everything is imported or was imported there. The commanding heights of the economy, the planning commission, the fundamentals of the economy which Nehru, the self-reliance concept, the green revolution, this is what are the pillars on which India stands today. And therefore, for anybody to suggest, can you see me and hear me? There was an interruption. Can you see me and hear me? Can you
Yes,
see?
sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So, therefore, in that context, I think it's ill-informed criticism to say that we are some kind of an Adam Smith invisible hand country where capitalism, Adam Smith's invisible hand, will take care of everything. That is why the much laughed schemes are today the toast of the cocktail. The world's largest social welfare scheme, Manrega. Do you know the safety net it created in the 2008 crisis? And possibly, if properly used today, the safety net it will create in Corona crisis. The world's largest Bima Yojana. The world's largest Food Security Act. Yes, you can criticize them as paternalistic, too much of Big Brother, but India is different than the West. And I'll end on this socialism by reminding you my own old formulation decades ago. Remember, the definitions of left and right are different in India than they are in Western democracies. I've been saying for a long time that the most right-wing party of India, the most right-wing political party of India, whoever it is, will be still to the left of the Democratic Party of the US. And the Democrats in the US are considered highly left-wing. So you have to understand your context. My fourth pillar is Parliament, which is in a sense my first institutional pillar. But let's not complicate numbers. It's my fourth pillar. Friends, we tend to forget that we do not have a democracy only. We say we are a proud world's largest democracy. We have a parliamentary democracy. There are two words, not one. So the word democracy is prefixed with parliamentary, which we tend to forget. So Parliament in that sense is the heart and soul of our democracy. It has been called in the 1960s the grand inquest of the nation. You know, now in my third term, when I sit in Central Hall, and Central Hall, by the way, is the world's biggest gossip center, the world's biggest, not India's. I admire the strength that you would have a party X leader, even a prime minister sitting in the first row, a party Y leader behind, a party Z leader on the left, and all having coffee and discussing anything under the sun. The old rule, of course, nowadays the youngsters don't realize it. used to be that everything in Central Hall is off the record unless you specifically put it on the record. That was the rule which all journalists used to follow. But can the two ladies in Bangladesh sit in their Central Hall or even cross paths in Central Hall, or at least people from their party? Can Ziaul Haq and Nawaz Sharif, could they have sat in Pakistan in their Central Hall? This is the strength of India, something we take for granted. The fact that Vajpayee telephones Sonia Gandhi or Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and says, congratulations, you won the election. Or for that matter, Manmohan Singh telephones the Prime Minister Modi and says, congratulations, you are now in power. I need to stop this. It's ringing again and again. Are you alright?
Yes, sir.
It's ringing here. Please stop it. Close it. I'll need the phone though. I'll need the phone later. It's ringing again and again. And it's coming here. Sorry, just a minute. I just settled. There is something. It's paired. It's empty here. Just close it. It's paired in some sense. Okay, can I continue, friends? I'm sorry for the interruption. It is for that reason. Just close it. It is for that reason. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
It is for that reason that I abhor the development of the culture of vendetta politics. It used to be a disease which started slowly in the south of India. I won't name the state. It then spread a little bit to the east of India, much lesser in degree, and then spread for a while to a northern prosperous state of India. But at the national level, it has not been a reality largely during my times. And I think it is something we have to cherish and fight to keep that way. Because the day that happens, the Central Hall culture will go and the SARC culture, which we have amongst our neighbors, will come back. What are my wish list for reform for Parliament? A, I find that the problem with parliamentary democracy, and I'm a stickler for parliamentary, I don't want presidential, but I want reforms within parliamentary, is that individual member of parliament creativity is stifled. We have a system where the cabinet is a subset of the legislature. The executive is a subset of the legislature. The legislature and the executive together are the ruling party, majority rule. Now, the casualty is individual MPs and individual creativity of MPs. Why? Because of a monster there, a beast called the whip. Unlike US, individual MPs in India do not create, initiate or move legislation. A senator creates and moves legislation, very creative stuff. That's why you have the Dodd Act or the Singhvi Act in America. Here, barring the exception of the private members bill, which is more a symbolic gesture on Friday afternoons, not really law, because 99.99% of such initiatives do not get converted into law. They are just to air grievance by the MP. So the legislative agenda is that which the government of the day, which means the cabinet of the day, gives. And the whip means that you cannot vote on individual merits. Now I have a simple solution. The object of the whip was to say that when the confidence of the government is shaken and the government will fall, you should have a whip. So if I belong to your party and if there is a vote, let us say on the finance bill or on a matter which says this house has no confidence in Prime Minister X, then I must be obliged under my party's whip to vote because I am a member and I must protect my party. But in all the other legislations which have nothing to do with confidence of the house, which may not even have fiscal consequences, by a simple two-line amendment to the law, you can say that a government can be endangered only by a confidence motion so styled and so moved, where the whip will apply. In all other matters, members of parliament should be left free to air their own creative instincts. And let me tell you, contrary to what you think, there is huge disruption there, and you see those terrible images on your screens. But you go on a working day in the heat of the summer and sit in the Parliament House at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and you'll hear a lone unknown member speaking and such gems of treasure of wisdom and information. These are of course not reported by the press because they want sensationalism. This is substance, and that is why individual member of parliaments have experience, have creativity, which is deadened by the whip, which I want to be amended in this fashion. Disruption, something which you see makes me hang my head in shame. I think here the problem is who will guard the guardians. The problem is how will the police punish themselves. It's no need for change of law. There are ample powers of the Speaker, from expulsion, debarment, suspension, physical removal, blah blah. It's a question of implementation. I think the Speakers, political parties have to reach a consensus that we will not seek populism and popularity, but take these stringent measures. And two things: disruptors have to lose their salary and allowances for the day or for the proportionate duration, and some of these harsher punishments of suspension, or at least debarment for the session, have to be exercised. But obviously, parliamentary solidarity makes it a difficult thing to implement. I think one major thing which will make a difference in this is the office of Speaker. Indians always expect the impossible, so we make high-sounding moral principles which have no reality-based practice. We say a Speaker is, of course, an individual MP who is a party person, and the day I appoint you Speaker, you are supposed to become godlike. Leave all your party affiliations, become an independent. You neither see nor hear any MP or party, and you become divine. That doesn't happen in practice. England is a very simple example to follow. They used to decide more or less in advance who would be the Speaker, and then virtually set up no contest in the constituency from where the Speaker would stand for election. So all parties would say, for this person, let him be Speaker after election. We will set up no candidate to rival him. Look at the strength and independence of that Speaker. Because for disruptions not to occur, the Speaker and the ruling party to which the Speaker has to belong must show fairness, must show conviviality, collegiality. And we have not developed that system of having a unanimous selection of a Speaker. We still have a party political selection, and therefore these aberrations are bound to occur. Of course, this has a very direct impact on the Speaker's role as a judge in the 10th schedule, which I'll be touching upon shortly. My fifth pillar is the judiciary. Remember, each of these are pillars, be it non-institutional, secularism, federalism, socialism, be it institutional, parliamentary democracy, parliament, and now the courts, judiciary. It is a remarkable pillar which has exceeded all expectations. Its reach, its consequences are humongous. When people abroad talk of judicial review and they cite Marbury and Madison and this and that, I would say the Indian court's power of judicial review, even at the High Court level, forget the Supreme Court, is unparalleled on planet Earth. It would make Marbury Madison of the Supreme Court of US in the 18th century blush. We are the inventor of PILs. Indeed, we are the inventor of basic structure. Imagine this fantastic concept that even a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional. Something, of course, which I would call the joint gift of Mr. Palkiwala and the 13th judge in those 13 judges of Keshavananda Bharati, Khanna J, Justice Khanna, who was undecided, a little unclear, but he went with the 7. Otherwise, it was 6-6 both ways. What is it that affects the scourge of this pillar, the judiciary, with this such humongous creative powers? And we have the best and the brightest in our legal fraternity and in our judicial fraternity. And yet we have two scourges which need reform. The first is the obvious, and that is the scourge of arrears, pendency, beating the backlog, the battle of the bulge. Its problem and the amount we talk about it is matched only by the simplicity of the solutions available to solve it. It really makes me laugh when I find why are people not prepared to solve it. There is a very interesting, I'm trying to find it as I speak to you. There is a very interesting quotation from Nani Palkiwala himself, which illustrates the problem. It might sound insulting to a lot of us, but as Palkiwala himself said, unless words are an assault on the senses, reform will not occur. And this is the quotation from Palkiwala. Many, many decades ago, he said, "May I now turn to the situation in India, which has the second largest number of lawyers in the world. While it is true that justice should be blind, in our country it is also lame. It barely manages to hobble along. The law may or may not be an ass, but in India it is certainly a snail. It moves so slowly that it might be considered too slow in a community of snails. A lawsuit once started in India is the nearest thing to eternal life ever seen on this earth. Some say that litigation in India is a form of fairly harmless entertainment. If so, it seems to me to be a very expensive way of keeping the citizenry amused. If litigation, Palkiwala continued, were to be included in the Olympics, India would be quite certain of winning at least one gold medal, unquote. The point is not the words, the point is the sentiment behind it. Now, why I said the simplicity of the solution would make you laugh. One, we don't do things that adopt one plan of 5 items and apply them uninterruptedly for 5 years. You will see the results in less than 3 years. Each of us wants to put our stamp on the solutions. Each of one does mid-course correction. Each of us one does zigzagging. That's one reason why things don't work. Second, suppose you had lovely hospitals, fantastic medical equipment, but no doctors. Would you be able to treat and have a fantastic medical system? So it's the same. We have strengths in the constitution. We have buildings, we have courtrooms, we even have technology, but we have no judges. 2 statistics will shock you, 2 or 3 statistics. Way back in 91, and 91 is 30 years ago, when I was a young lawyer, I remember being in court. Affidavit was filed in Chief Justice Ranganath Mishra's court by the central government saying that from 1950 independence till that date, there has never been a time when at least 1/3 of all the 1,000 or 1,100 total judges of the High Court in our country, 1/3 posts have been vacant. Now the amazing statistic, the same is true today. At any point of time, the figure is now roughly 1,100 judges. Remember, in a country of 1.25 billion, you can roughly expect a litigating or a potentially litigating public of 300 million. For that, we have 1,100 High Court judges. 1/3 posts are always vacant at any point of time since the 75 years of our republic. The lower judiciary has 22,000. I mean, I'm giving you broad figures. It is 21,000 something, sometimes 22,000. Of which 1/4 or 1/5 have always been vacant at all points of time in our 70 years of development. How on earth, without appointment, can you deal with this pendency, which is static at 3 crores? Every Chief Justice comes, everybody gives a seminar, we don't do practical things. Why don't we make 2 tracks? As of September 18, a very small figure of 25 or 30 lakhs in the whole country were cases above 10 years old. Why can't we make a track of High Court and Supreme Court and District Court judges dealing only with older than 10 lakh cases, 10 years cases? Will it not clear it in 2 years? And a separate track will deal with normal filings and normal matters. We don't do it, I don't know why. Our judge per million population ratio, that is number of judges per million, has crawled agonizingly slowly. I use the word crawled from 1991, 10 per million. Now, in 2000, 1999, 10 per million, after 20 years to 19 per million, and that is after Supreme Court has given a stick after stick to say increase. The ideal is said to be 50 judges per million, which is more than what that USA has. At least 35 would be a manageable figure. Of course, another funny thing it hides and is misleading is that we have increased the strength of each High Court manifold, strength of District Court. Decades ago, so a strength of Calcutta High Court would have been X, and 20 years ago it would already been made 10 X plus Y. But now the funny thing, we are today and in most High Courts mostly functioning at less than the X strength. Forget the increased strength. Allahabad High Court, of course, is the most extreme example. For a long time, out of its 160 strength, it had less than 80 judges. It now, I believe, is somewhere near 100 or slightly over 110, maybe. When we as parliamentarians get a bill for enactment into act, we get at the end of it a financial impact memorandum. This law, when it becomes a law, is likely to cost so much. That itself was added some decades ago. It used not to be there always. We have been pleading, I have spoken for decades. Why does a similar memorandum not come? It's a half page required at the end of each bill called the Judicial Impact Memorandum. This law we are passing, sir, is likely to create so much litigation, a statistical study suggests. We don't have it. You know the result? Somebody did a study and said that 2 sections, I'm not saying they're good or bad, I'm not saying they should continue or be repealed, two sections which lawyers understand as 498A, the dowry section, and 138, the negotiable instruments check bouncing section as popularly known, have in 2017 just these two categories, laws which we made with much fanfare without judicial impact studies, 70 lakh cases pending. They are the two highest single categories because we've done a category-wise analysis. I've given you 6 reasons for arrears. 7th reason, there are innumerable cases of the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court judgment gives guidance for the whole country. It decides a law point and then all high courts follow it, so there's less litigation, more certainty. You and I arrange our affairs accordingly. Well, a Supreme Court decides in division benches, 2 judges. The same matter decided as X starts binding high courts. Meanwhile, the 2 in another case refer that 2 to a 3. By the time the 3 starts, hundreds of high courts have followed the 2. The 3 decide and then it is referred to 5 and then to 7. The law is settled. I have a chart which I don't want to trouble you with. It takes 10 years. That law point, which was settled by 2 judges, is ultimately settled by 7 judges by, if you are lucky, 10 years. In the meanwhile, the progeny spawned by lower courts, which includes high courts and district courts, following those judgments which are zigzagging in the Supreme Court, is millions or thousands. 2 classic examples, both of which I happen to be a part. Balco in arbitration. By the time Bhatia was overruled by Balco and the law settled by 5 judges, I gave a chart to the court when arguing that these are the number of major high court judgments which have either followed Bhatia or not followed or distinguished Bhatia. Same thing happened with the 2015 amendment to the Arbitration Act, what lawyers call an auto stay on filing a section 34. There are innumerable high courts which have taken one view, another set of high courts have taken another view, and lower courts, I don't know what poor fellows will be doing. Before, in 2018, Justice Nariman's judgment settled the law. This mercifully took only 3.5 years. A 8th reason, I'm giving you all simple, elemental and elementary reasons for arrears, and we are still grappling after 70 years. We have, do you know, not looked at, never used Article 226A of the Indian Constitution, which provides for ad hoc judges. It was created somewhere in 1963, never once used at the High Court level. Do you know that it allows, this is to meet your gap in appointment. You have politics when I propose your name. You don't appoint for months. It takes months for a name to go to the High Court Collegium. It takes further months to be cleared by the Supreme Court Collegium. If all goes well, that person is then held up by the central government. Whole process may take 1 year. In the meanwhile, there is a provision in our Constitution, tried and tested talent which is retired can be used as ad hoc judges in the High Court and in the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, in my lifetime, only 4 or 5 times it has been used. But in the High Court, not once. It allows one Chief Justice of High Court X to recruit and make any retired judge, not only of his own High Court, but of another High Court, with central government concurrence, into his court. These are people who are retired, who will do 2 or 3 years work and will clear all your older than 10 years criminal appeals, older than 5 years Motor Vehicles Act, whatever you want to call it. These kind of categories. Why have you not used it? No real answer. ADR, of course, is vital. I am privileged in that I was part of a high-powered committee in the early 90s. Our report came in the mid-90s. It became law in 1999 and was enacted formally in 2002 July. It is now known to you as Section 89, a menu of ADR options. So one way is to make sure that the clogged pipeline of litigation moves faster within the pipeline. The other is to declog that pipeline like an artery and make cases go outside and subject to ADR. And our report, which I had the great pleasure of drafting in a big manner, led to the menu of ADR options which we adopted in one sense from the home of alternative dispute resolution, California. Barring judicial settlement, which is prevalent in America, we have a large menu card, as you know, of mediation, settlement, conciliation, lok adalat, blah, blah. And that is another way of dealing with it. There are many more. Fast-track courts have not got their due. They have not been expanded on silly excuses of lack of funds. Gram Nyayalayas for very low kind of offences, which you may call less than compoundable, but still they clog your pipeline, have virtually become defunct. These are things we have to reactivate. I could go on, but at the end of the day, the sentiment is important. As somebody said, if you don't do these things, then those poignant two lines will apply, which is that दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर एक झूठ, दोपहर तक बिक गया बाजार का हर एक झूठ, और मैं एक सच को लेकर शाम तक बैठा रहा. This is the scourge of otherwise a fantastic system. And the second scourge, friends, of the judicial system is allegations growing much more so than when we started practice at all levels of malpractices and corruption. We can't ignore them. We should not ignore them, brush them under the carpet. My solution is A, we have provided principally only one method. It is like saying that there is only one punishment for this crime, death penalty, and nothing less. There is no graded set of punishments. That is death penalty's impeachment. An almost impossible or very difficult thing to do. No lesser, easily imposable punishment. I happened to chair, when I was chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law, we had made a draft of a Judicial Accountability and Standards Bill, which gives a graded hierarchy of punishments: warning, censure, suspension, removal. Of course, we had kept it all in-house. It is still going to be by judges, but a more structured system, a statutory system. Well, it never became law. I happened to chair the committee which recommended it. We have not agreed even to have a Judicial Appointments Commission, which could not only give power of appointment and transfer, but also give the power of checking egregious behavior. Remember, all these models will either have 100% judges or at least 80% judges. It is not that we are having an external element, but judges don't like it, they will strike it down, or the parliamentarians will not be united in passing a law. So what is the result, friends? The result is a very unsatisfactory one of appointment by you, transfer by you, because you are the appointing authority of yourself, transfer by you, disciplining by you, all in-house. Friends, that creates an absolutely unacceptable trust deficit. My sixth pillar, you can see that I'm hurrying because I want to finish before 1:15 with your permission. I think I should be able to do it. I'm giving you a synoptic account, but I think it illustrates the pillars we have of our democracy. My sixth pillar, friends, is the most unaccountable pillar of Indian democracy, but a vital one, humongous reach, like the judiciary. Judiciary, by the way, is much less accountable than the executive. And media is much less accountable than the judiciary. You know, I always like to say that people in public life, media can take their pants off. You can attack them. Their own political parties have all kinds of things about them. Many of them are subject to re-election. Where are any of these checks in 50% measure on judges? And where are they at all on media? Well, it is an undoubted pillar of Indian democracy, a vibrant pillar. It must be there, it must be strengthened, but the malpractices must be curbed. Before I give you a quick wish list, remember, we have, and it's a dated figure, it's about 2 or 3 years dated, but it gives you an idea. We have 400 dailies. We have, of course, registered newspapers with the registrar of newspapers, RNI, is 1 lakh. Many of them are defunct, they don't function. 500 TV channels. Peak time viewership goes up to 600 million. 600 million. That's more than half our population, or about half our population. In September 18, the figure I have is that satellite-based private channels were 872. Now, what is my wish list? One, the wish list follows from the complaints, the laments, which I am doing now. A, remember that in the press, there is a widest variation of quality and standards. Top quality coexists with rank gutter level yellow journalism. So it's many Indias within one. Second, you have to attack the syndrome in the equation called sense versus sensationalism. There will always be sensationalism. There will always be some sense. The problem is you have to step in and correct when the ratios get mixed up. So perhaps when the ratios in the old days might have been 70-30, now the ratios may become 30-70. This sensationalism, 70%, is what has considerably weakened this sixth pillar of mine of Indian democracy. What is the main reason for sensationalism? one of the biggest frauds played on the people of India and of many other countries, willingly, consensually, without check for decades. And that is the fraud of TRP. TRP, I'm not talking only of visual media. The print media is much better off. They at least have a circulation test. But the visual media has a TRP, television rating point system, done by a so-called agency, which is the most ridiculous in a country the size of India. They used to have, and now must be double or treble, some 25,000 meters, supposedly random placed across the country, which supposedly measure peak time viewership. On that 25,000, even if you assume to be 50,000 now, you decide the rating of a channel. But that rating is the entire basis of advertisement. And the advertisement is the entire basis of the content. Back to back, TRP determines how much sensationalism, how little sense. There have been calls, vested interest, nobody wants to deal with the tyranny of the TRP. A truly independent statutory body which determines ratings and starts giving proper quality so that junk and gutter things may not get higher ratings, and thereby they reproduce themselves in more junk and more garbage, because TRP is what gets you the money. Also, of course, I used to joke that the TRP of 25,000 meters in a country the size of India means that those who run the TRP must get the Nobel Prize for miniaturization from a sample size of that kind. Defamation laws in India are weak. The old Privy Council judgment says that defamation in India frequently starts after the complainant files defamation. That is why there is irresponsibility in the press. Regulators are toothless. I'm sorry to use such strong words, but I follow Palkiwala. Words must be an assault on the senses, otherwise reform will not follow. The regulators are Press Council of India and the guilds. Do they really regulate? You know, we have this quaint notion, and I'm sorry this applies partly to our other regulators also, MCI, Medical Council, Bar Council, etc. We have this quaint notion of peer regulation from Britain. A peer must regulate a peer. Has it really worked in India? That should be a subject of a separate debate. But certainly for the press, it has not. For 30 years, friends, in this country, we have pending a broadcasting bill. Some version or the other of a broadcasting bill is floating around in Parliament for over 30 years now. It's never passed because it doesn't suit anybody to pass it. It is a bill which seeks to create Chinese walls between conflicts of interest in the press. You know, the biggest threats to press freedom come from within the press, and there within they come from the top level and the second level of the press. The middle level and the lower level journalists are largely independent. That's not where the insidious press freedom is compromised. It is compromised at the top and the immediate second level, where there are conflicts of interest, be it business interests or other interests. Well, law has to create Chinese walls between such press interests and business interests. At least very clear Chinese walls of disclosure, so you can make your own judgment. I've given you a few, I have many more which I don't have time for. Paid news is another example, for example. But let me move on to my seventh pillar of Indian democracy. I have 9, so I shouldn't take too long. Election Commission. Again, a conception of an institution which has outstripped all imagination of its creators. You know, generally there are countries around the world who want to sublease our election commission, to say, you conduct our elections and we'll pay you a fee. Of course, Indian law doesn't permit it. So in the name of consultancy, without much money, our commission helps out many countries, not only in Africa, but even in Europe and South America. They conduct a humongous job, an amazing job. And at the end of the day, with very serious aberrations, which I don't have time to go into, it has acquitted itself rather well. We have to guard against its politicization. And the simple way to guard against politicization is to simply put a ban on all appointments of ECs or retired CECs into any governmental sinecure or political post-retirement. I confess that all parties have done it, are still doing it. And by the way, this prescription of ban applies to 3 sectors immediately: Election Commission, CAG and Judiciary. including egregious cases of judicial appointments after retirement now and before. But I also condemn campaigns of calumny carried out because of decisions given by the Election Commission to browbeat them or pressurize them. All parties are prone to do it. Any party needs to be condemned if they do it. We've had examples where a dissenting orders by a commissioner out of the three, and remember the Supreme Court is the one which pronounced from Mr. Gill's time, from Mr. Sessions' times, that all three are equal. A dissenting order is not published, only the majority, and the reasons are not published. And the mere dissent has led to a lot of grief to a particular election commissioner in our system. I think these are things we have to guard against. We have to guard against the fact that our law, the Representation of People's Act, many of you may have done election petitions as lawyers, has a section from the 1950s that election petitions must be decided by courts in 6 months. We gave the power of a primary court to elect for election. If I challenge the election of yours, it has to go to the High Court. Old days used to go to a tribunal. The High Court by law, by a statute, is supposed to decide in 6 months. If I was to ask all of you, 500 or 700 or 800 of you, to put up their hands, how many election petitions are decided in 6 months? None of you can put up your hands. Well, what is the point of a law? Because by the time it is decided, the 5-year term is over. So unless the allegation is a corrupt practice, which involves a 6-year disqualification, most election petitions are decided by infructuousness. Therefore, the teeth of the law is rendered nugatory. I think we need to have a great important look on electoral rolls. Our democracy is robust, but God lies in the detail, devil lies in the detail. Big principles, let them take care. You take care of the small things, the big ones will take care of themselves. Electoral roll fudging can change results. Results can change democracy. Democracy is basic structure. So something, free and fair elections being held by constitutional benches to be part of democracy and therefore part of basic structure. Well, at the base of it lies electoral rolls, which have to be accurate, constantly updated, and some of the figures which we have found in recent elections of electoral rolls which are out of date run into lakhs, something in the public interest which must be addressed. Friends, let me spend 2 minutes on something which is not a pillar, but I mentioned it in passing because it pretends to be a pillar and we must debunk it so its pretensions end. That is so-called public participation, a new paradigm of a pillar of Indian democracy which sought to project itself in 2008, 9, 10. Part of the Jantar Mantar movement, part of the Hazare movement, part of this so-called Kejriwal movement, which led to some good things like AAP, etc. I'm not saying no. But what is the heart of the philosophical concept underlying that, which is vitiated? It is that the public at the Maidan in Bombay or at Jantar Mantar in Delhi have the right to pass laws because that public knows what is good for the country. And parliamentary sovereignty be damned. Parliamentary sovereignty is at an end. Do you know this is the philosophical debate at the heart of the Hazare movement? It's a supreme irony that a lot of people rode piggyback on that movement and then did not do anything about a Lokpal bill for 6 years, the full term of their government. And even today, the Lokpal, which is created about a year ago, is non-functional, completely non-functional. Took 5 years to even create it. But that is a different debate. The heart of constitutional parliamentary democracy is that elected representatives have a subgroup called the cabinet. They propose a law, the cabinet passes it, the legislature then passes it in the larger superset, and then through the president it becomes law. And since the people are represented in that assembly, that law is deemed to be passed by the people. The people cannot be redefined as a group of self-appointed people sitting at Jantar Mantar and at Maidan in Mumbai to decide a law for you. And remember, in 2009, the exact quoted argument was, we are giving you this law which we have drafted. You, if you change it also, Parliament, we will not accept it. Beware, don't change it, Parliament. So, this is parliamentary sovereignty in the dustbin. There is no such pillar in the name of public participation. As I said, in the name of a representative democracy, you are decimating democracy itself. Friends, my eighth pillar is the CAG, an extremely professional body for many decades. Unfortunately, for some years now, it has again become politicized. It became politicized in the late 90s once, when for the first time a retired CAG was made a governor and into the upper house. But cases were few and far between. It has again come into the political arena. I think it is one of the most professional bodies. In fact, it will thrill your hearts if you meet the young officers of the CAG, which only function from every state capital. They are the backbone of the CAG. The CAG is only one name at the top, but the CAG also applies to the collectivity. Only way is, as I said, ban all post-retirement appointments and things will be all right. And that, I said, applies equally to judges, to CAGs and to ECs. Oversight is the heart of CAG, and that oversight requires independence and objectivity, and independence and objectivity cannot be allowed to be diluted. My last pillar, ninth pillar, is the army. Pillar of Indian democracy. Friends, there are some entities and pillars whose biggest shield, kavach, is their anonymity. As somebody said, an army should be like a parda-nashin lady. I'm not meaning it in any sexist sense. Only to be seen, not to be heard. Seeing the army reassures you. They are omnipresent, omnipotent, but in the backdrop. In UK, nobody discusses the army. In India, for several decades, even today, I don't think you discuss the army. You know it's there, protecting you, but you don't think of it. That is an institutional pillar of tremendous importance. Remember, a man-eater becomes a man-eater the first time he tastes blood. It's only the first time. Our neighbors in South Asia, the most inimical neighbor tasted blood in 1956. And once you taste blood, you can never reverse it. You can never rewind. You have to prevent the first tasting of blood. And that in 1956 was tasted by General Ayub Khan. I think the anonymity of the army behind a civilian face is the heart of it. Again, do not for God's sake politicize them. Do not for God's sake bring them to the forefront as your puppets to make your political point. Say what you like, take it on your shoulders. It is the most dangerous game you are playing, and I mean this for everybody, not for party A or party B. Aberrations have occurred in the recent past, and I am condemning them. Surgical strikes were not born after 2014. They will not end with this or that government. We have documented details of prior ones. But the important point is, do it, decimate Pakistan, hit it hard in the solar plexus. Don't politicize it. Don't put our army people, army person one is trying to get ahead of you to prove my loyalty more by saying I did a better strike. And you are trying to get ahead of number 3 to say you did it better. That is a dangerous trend. Well, friends, I have come to the end, almost in time, a little over time, and 2 or 3 minutes more. You know, as I end, I must tell you, I could have some more pillars, which I don't really have time for. But these are the basic, most important, fundamental pillars, institutional and non-institutional, of Indian democracy. No doubt I have done a fan dancer's job. I have drawn attention to the subject without really covering it, because you can't. As I come to the end, I think about it myself and I say, we are a great, largest democracy, the only one out of those 30, 40 countries I mentioned. But we are an imperfect democracy. A real one, no doubt, but an imperfect one. And we must remember that always, because the journey remains, whether we are imperfect by 50% or the glass is 3/4 full and unfull by 25% is a matter of debate. But the quality, improving the quality of our democracy should engage us for the next 75 years as we celebrate our 75th birthday in the near future. It is not achievement mere of public ballot democracy, which we have achieved. We got women voting much before Western so-called developed economies did. We have the world's largest, America, Europe and parts of Asia put together, more people voting in an election than anywhere else. But that is the quantitative test. We have not traveled to the more capacious concept of beyond public balloting, of beyond one man, one vote, one person, one vote, to the exercise of public reason, informed public choice. You know, in England, if you get a ticket from any party, be it Conservative, be it Labour or be it Liberal, that ticket is 90% given because that party's local council and the intermediate council analyzes you and sends the name up. Bottom up democracy. I'm talking about the ticket. No party in India does it except to a very minor degree. That is the more capacious, desirable concept of democracy. Friends, the object of all of us, whether you are of persuasion X, philosophy Y, or party Z, is to make the India of our dreams. Equally, all of us face huge roadblocks and huge problems in both perception and performance. Sometimes the problems seem too large, that look, we'll never have this because it's too large a problem. Well, I always remind myself of Tagore at such times. Ekla chalo, two words which are fantastic. Or, if it's even bigger, remind yourself of Iqbal, who said, मैं अकेला ही चला था जानिबे मंजिल, मैं अकेला ही चला था जानिबे मंजिल, लोग आते रहे और कारवां बन गया. But friends, lastly, if you ignore these problems, if you ignore our institutional and non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy, you do it at your great grave peril. The lessons of history are condemned to be repeated. The blunders of history are condemned to be repeated if you do not learn its true lessons. And again, Iqbal is apt to remind you that you must learn the lessons of history. एक ख्वाब सा देखा था ताउम्र नींद आई, एक ख्वाब सा देखा था ताउम्र नींद आई, लम्हों ने खता की, ब्लंडर किया, सदियों ने सजा पाई. Thank you very much. And sorry for taking slightly longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singhvi. Some of our attendees have questions for you. If Advocate Dinesh Rajpurohit could unmute himself, please, and just ask your question, Dr. Singhvi.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Aditya Lota, if you could unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Hello. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Thanks a lot for this information session. I have two questions. First is, all the issues that you mentioned, are they only solvable at the central level, or do any of do states have any powers to actually institute reforms? And secondly, how much do you think that lobbying or electoral funding from corporates play a role in instituting or stifling it?
Obviously, my topic is very large, so the questions are bound to be large. I'll give short, pointed answers, which are not complete answers. The first question, certainly not the center alone, certainly not the states alone. As a matter of fact, my entire, possibly longest 10 minutes on federalism underlined 2 or 3 basic points which I won't repeat, but which are an answer to your question. Our framers conceived of India largely as a federal unit, mostly central initiatives. But in actual practice, we are much, much more federal. Center still has the lead. If you were to put a percentage, which is artificial, I would say 60-40, or 65-35. But 35 is a large percentage. So in every which way, cooperative federalism in spheres ABC, along with competitive federalism in spheres XYZ, is the need of the hour. Cooperative federalism, in that, for example, you have an excellent scheme for poor. Let not, now the institutionalized paradigm of India after 1991 is, more than ever before, that the party in power in center and the state is likely to be 60-70% different. Now, cooperative federalism needs to take care of this dilemma, which was not anticipated by our framers to this degree, and not even in practice till the 90s. If there is a pro-poor scheme, people have to do it not because Mr. Mehta's scheme or Singhvi's scheme or XYZ scheme. Equally, competitive federalism requires that you fiercely compete in showing your performance. in grabbing the best manufacturing so that the next state gives more incentives to get a better manufacturing. So I think these are really somewhat unequal but still two sets of different wheels. Your second question was about corporate funding. Well, I think in a very simple way, I would welcome any funding, even from the devil, so long as there is utter and complete transparency. The Americans do it well, and this applies to a lot of things. You know, even if the devil donates, so long as I know that the devil has donated to Mr. Mehta 100 rupees, I can draw my own conclusions. It is opacity which creates a problem. You know, in America, 99% of funds, including from devils, are all reported. But the problem is that you supposedly create a transparent paradigm which is actually opaque. And the classic example is electoral bonds. The bizarre reason given is to protect the donor. That's precisely the reason why it's not transparent. So, answer to your question is corporate funding, why not? Get the people to do good things. But equally, when I know that 99% of the 100 rupees that Mr. Mehta has got has come from XYZ, there is always a check not only on others but on Mr. Mehta's behavior and of course on my knowledge. That we don't do correctly and we should do.
Thank you, sir. There's a question from Ruben Vakil. Ruben, could you ask your question, please?
Hello. Good afternoon, sir.
Yes.
So this relates to the appointment of judges and the backlog in the judiciary. So do you think the time has come to maybe go lower on the unconventional age of 45 years for appointment of judges to the higher judiciary? Because that's probably the unstated convention in Bombay. I'm not too sure of the other courts, but so do you think that there are people, the opportunity to younger people to get judges so that they get a longer tenure and probably a chance to even go to the Supreme Court to make it a little more lucrative?
If you're talking of solutions, these are very cosmetic and maybe non-solutions. Number one, there was no written rule for decades. Even today, it is virtually non-written, but it is now informally in some resolutions in writing. Number two, up to now and including now, the actual practice followed is you show me the color of your hair and I will show you the rule. So there are enough exceptions and derogations to make it a non-rule, the so-called rule. When I don't want to appoint you, 45 is pressed into service. But let me for a minute assume that we just stick to 45. The real problem is not finding young people. The real problem are other things. Today I give an example always to audiences. If you were to find 3 non-lawyers with no idea of law and say that I'm giving you 1 month, you visit 3 high courts, spend 1 month at your own choice and tell me within 1 month whom do you think are the best 5 lawyers in each of the high courts, 15 persons to be appointed to the high court of that particular one. A non-lawyer with no idea of the structure will be able to give you a fairly accurate report because he will objectively come and tell you that I have gone around. I can understand that the chaps who are in good practice, who are decent, who are competent, etc. are these 5. Maybe they'll say 7. If you match all the lists, you may have some divergence, but largely there will be convergence. 100%, 90% there will be convergence. What happens in our country? We have these great big collegiums. We have these great big committees and bodies. We first identify names for appointment and we all know who are those 5. We then start doing processes for disappointment, not appointment. Politics which will make the politics of politicians blush starts in the judiciary. I'm not talking of this level or that level. It continues right till the end. Unless you cure that, why will a person X who's in reasonably good practice wait for more than a few months after he's been informally asked by the chief justice who's sending his name? He loses a lot. And somebody who's really meritorious would not be interested. You drag him, you shame him, you keep him like Trishanku in suspended animation. These are the things you have to address, not young or old.
Dinesh Rajpurohit, please go ahead.
Sir, whether there is a power to a parliament that it can delete whole Constitution of India by full majority in the future if it comes in whole majority? There is any power?
Thank God there is none. Our framers and our thinking so thought till 1973. As I just said, it's too long to discuss. But we have to thank Palkiwala and that one judge out of 13 who tilted slightly. Keshwanan Bharti was born. And A, you can amend the constitution by following a 2/3 present and voting system. Parliament can do that. B, the court will decide whether what you have amended affects the basic structure. C, if it finds that the amendment affects the basic structure, it will strike down the constitutional amendment itself. And D, it is the courts which will decide not in an exhaustive prior notified list what is the basic structure, but on a case-to-case basis. Look at the width and the power. This is, I think, the ultimate bulwark which cannot, at least in my lifetime or barring some unforeseen event, make India a total dictatorship. Cannot.
Abhijit Marathe, please ask your question.
Dr. Singhvi, what are your views on the position of advocates in the whole justice delivery system, and what can you suggest to the advocates to contribute for reducing the backlog of cases and improving the justice delivery system?
First answer, you have to have a webinar for this. I can't answer it. It's a large topic, but they have an indispensable role. I think lawyers across the board have to be more constructive. I say it with great humility and with genuine affection because I am a part of you. I've spent my entire lifetime. I've had a privilege of being, in that sense, part of the executive, part of the judiciary, being a lawyer, and part of the legislature. But I have spent longest in this part of the world, judiciary. Judiciary, I mean the legal system, not a judge. Well, I think our roles are not as constructive always, and I don't mean A or B. Take an example. A lot of reforms in India don't work because there is always one side to litigation in India which is simply interested in delay. Simply. Delay for the heck of delay. Always. So all your theories and amendments founder. Second, deliberate night watchmanship and padding for the client where you know that there is a unreasonableness in it. And of course, there are many other things. Play with a straight bat. Cooperate. You know, a lawyer is a very difficult job. He has to have honor and a commitment to his client. He has to fight fearlessly and fight anything for a client. But along with that, simultaneously, it's an almost impossible job to do, but that's the way our ethics books describe it. He has to perform his duty to the court, which even the court may not understand, or a poor judge may not be able to discharge. That is the duty of fairness and balance. Along with that, he has a third duty simultaneously. A duty to the larger judicial system, not to that court, not to that matter alone. Now, to marry these three is, if it's just present to your mind when you are doing a case, will make all the difference. Take every break, but don't take a break which will break the system.
Yash Momaya.
Thank you, sir.
So, would you say there is a need to democratize the Supreme Court by creating circuit benches at major cities apart from Delhi?
A lot of people so believe, some eminent people have proposed. I am totally against it. Of course, they are very short answers. Reason number one, according to me, in our 15 courts, I think we are now functioning. Maybe 16 sometime, but 15 courtrooms. Sometimes we joke that in those 15 courtrooms we may be having, if not 15, maybe 10 Supreme Courts. Not one Supreme Court. Bench inconsistency, which is not entirely amazing, especially in miscellaneous matters, but bench inconsistency in terms of final decisions has grown to such unmanageable proportions that the very integrity, the unity of the system is threatened. If that is happening in one Supreme Court building where at least you are coalesced, do you think that there will be at all a Supreme Court worth the name if you have a Bangalore bench, or a Kolkata bench, or a Bombay bench? If you are so enamored and if you have so many pendencies, you make a centralized Supreme Court, constitutional court, a pure constitutional court in the broad sense of a court of cassation like France or things like that, and have a court of appeal with 4 benches. But that's a different debate. To dilute an already diluted and distorted Supreme Court. You know, I must share with you, off the record, and obviously in light-hearted spirit, I told in my very young days Chief Justice Pathak, who was debating office, I said, "Sir, you will hold me for contempt of court, would you permit me?" And this is, imagine, in the 80s. Things are much worse now. I said, if you allow me, like an examiner's question, to draft an SLP, a hypothetical SLP, with 6 possible outcomes. You know, in exams you have like 6 possible answers to a question. It's not easy, but you can draft a hypothetical. And then anonymously circulate it as a real SLP to 6 benches. I am prepared to lay a bet that you might have 4 to 5 results, if not 6. He was first shocked, then he laughed and laughed and laughed. We did not test it because I would be held up for contempt. But this is what illustrates my point.
Last question, sir, is from Vaibhav Bhule. Vaibhav, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Sir, respectfully solicit your views on the role played by the governor in the recent times between the state and the center in a typical quasi-federal structure, and as Gandhiji always termed governor as an arbiter in light of the constitutional crisis.
I am very, very disappointed. Like most speakers, the office of governor has come into disrepute. It has come into dilution. It has come into degradation. I'm extremely sorry to use strong adjectives, but this is the truth. Reasons are many, but it can easily be solved if you take hard decisions. You have to realize, just read the debates, the Constituent Assembly debates. They make it clear that there is no diarchy contemplated in our system. There cannot be 2 centers of power in any state. I'm forgetting special states like Union Territories or Jammu and Kashmir, forget those. In a state so-called, you can't have 2 centers of power. You have only one center of power, the Chief Minister, good, bad, rotten or indifferent. But you have 1 or 2 very narrow specified powers for the governor, within which he has all the power, but he can't travel beyond. One obviously is the power of if a minority government happens or dissolution happens. 2 is the power, which is not his power, but he becomes the boss after that, is when 356 is imposed. Now, barring these 1 or 2 or 3, 163, 356, things like that, exceptional cases, governors who start poking their nose into administration are destroying the system. They either become agents of the central government, just because the party in power in the state is of a different political color. They don't achieve anything, but they set precedents which are horrible. And this applies to every state. I have written recently that, bluntly put, the governor has to reign, not rule. He has to be again something like that lady of the army, be seen, not heard. If he's aggrieved, he can write letters guiding, friend, philosopher and guide. If to his letters he gets a response, he has to be satisfied. If to his letters the change is not to his liking, he has to put it mildly and crudely, lump it. He has to just take it on his chin, grin and bear it. He cannot go and have press conferences against his own state. He cannot go and write complaints against his own state. He cannot badmouth his own chief minister. Now, these are so elementary, but they are observed in the breach increasingly in several states across India. And that is not the beginning, but the midway to the end if it continues.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Ravi Shankar Pandey.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tamal Singhvi. I have a question. I have two questions to be very precise. First, both based on your pillars of the democracy. The first being on judiciary. After the striking down of the NJSC bill, NJSC Act, is there, in your knowledge, do you know about the new process for appointment, a better process for appointment of judges instead of the traditional collegium method? And the second question is about CAG being the pillar. why is not the PM relief fund or the other CM relief funds audited by the CAG?
First, a very important, interesting question. I have been actually a supporter of the judicial collegium started in the 90s. The reason was that there were aberrations which happened just before that in the late 80s and 90s. Otherwise, central government primacy was the first model we tried for 45 years. And you'll be surprised, it went off rather well. There's complete primacy of central government in appointments, in theory. It wasn't too bad. From the 80s, late and 90s, it started getting distorted, which is why, along with the judges, I inclined to try a new system, the judicial collegium, born, as you know, by those 2-3 judgments. Now, when you tried that system from 90s to 2020, roughly 25 years or 30 years, and you have found so many aberrations too large to list, and I give you an example of Politicking just now, 5 minutes ago, then I have myself turned to the view that why not try a third system? One has been tried, you got a second one because it failed the first one. Now, has not the second one failed? Do you really think the politics of the judiciary has not considerably altered, if not destroyed, the judicial collegium system as conceived? If it has, why not try a third one? It may not be ideal. There's no answer to your question which is the best. We may fail, but it's time to try. Number 3, I happen to be the lead opening speaker both for the statutory bill and for the constitutional bill. 2 bills were moved for the National Judicial Appointments Commission. You'll be surprised, barring 1 or 2 members of parliament, they were passed unanimously. I opened the debate, by the way, by 99.999% of all MPs, something which is never seen in unanimity, about the judicial appointment bill, which, by the way, has about 3 or 4 judges out of 6 or 7 people. One is an academician, one is the Prime Minister, one is the Law Minister. Otherwise, all are judges. That passed, but after 2 years of suspended animation, it was struck down. So, I have become a proponent of trying the Judicial Appointments Commission, not a magic bullet, not an instant solution, but try it. Because unless you admit candidly that your existing system has failed, otherwise why would you have 60 appointments out of 160 not made? 33% vacancy in all high courts. Why? There has to be something wrong. You can't say, I will have exclusive monopolistic power to appoint and I will keep vacancy up to 33% and have 3 crore arrears in the country. The second question was CAG. Sorry, I forgot. CAG, what was your question? It was about accountability, something else? Hello, can you hear me? On CAG, the Prime Minister's relief. Prime Minister's relief.
Whether the CAG can audit the
Relief fund.
No,
I am totally against. It might sound political, but I'm very frank and candid. You have had for 40, 50, 60 years, I would say, PM and CM relief funds. They are nobody's fiefdom. One person is not PM for 70 years. One person is not CM for 60 years. First question, what is the need for having a separate thing? XYZ CARES fund. Why? What is wrong with the system which is governmental? 2, this new fund is not CAG audited. I am not suggesting that you are siphoning money, but is a audited CAG fund better existing for 60 years of our independence than a new animal created in the middle of Corona without auditing? 3, the trustees or the governors of this fund, which is shrouded in opacity, are individuals, however high they may be. And I'm not accusing them. I'm just saying structurally, why is it a better system? What is the need for it? No political color of no political Prime Minister felt it bad enough to scrap the earlier system for 60, 70 years, and even today you haven't scrapped it. Lastly, how can it be discriminatory? How can you have Sotela Vyavahar? I create a parallel fund. Suppose I create an incorporated society of lawyers parallelly with a slightly different name to avoid IPR issues, and say that will be exempt automatically by law to everything given there. Will anybody come to attend your webinar, seminar? If I donate in that one, everything is CSR. If I donate here, it is not. Does it require rocket science to understand what is happening?
Thank you, sir. May I request Mr. Mohit Kapoor to propose the formal vote of thanks, please?